In November of 1910, a private train car left a station in New Jersey in the middle of the night. No announcement was made, no passenger list was filed. The men who boarded that train used only their first names with each other, a precaution against being recognized by the porters and conductors who might talk. They carried their own bags rather than allowing luggage handlers to read the labels. One of them later wrote that if they had been discovered, the plan they were carrying would have been destroyed before it could be implemented. They were not discovered. The train traveled south through the night, arriving the following morning at Brunswick, Georgia. From there, the men boarded a private ferry to a place called Jekyll Island, a barrier island off the Georgia coast that was, at the time, the exclusive private preserve of some of the wealthiest families in America. The Jekyll Island Club, accessible only by private ferry, was where the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Morgans came to hunt and to be away from the world. It was, in short, the last place that journalists or government officials were likely to be watching. The men who made that journey in November 1910 included Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, who was chairman of the National Monetary Commission and one of the most powerful men in the United States Senate. They included Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York, at the time the largest bank in the country. They included Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. They included Benjamin Strong, also of J.P. Morgan. They included Paul Warburg, a German-born banker who had recently joined the firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and who was considered one of the most sophisticated monetary theorists in the world. And they included A. Piatt Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. 6 men gathered in secret on a private island, carrying the combined financial weight of institutions that controlled an estimated 1/4 of the world's wealth. They spent 9 days on Jekyll Island. When they left, they carried with them the draft of a document that would 3 years later become the Federal Reserve Act, the legislation that created the central banking system of the United States. The system that has managed American monetary policy ever since. The system that controls the money supply, sets interest rates, and serves as the lender of last resort to the American banking system. The system that governs the financial life of every person in the United States, created in secret by bankers on a private island that they were not supposed to be on. To understand why this meeting had to be secret, you have to understand what had happened to American banking in the years leading up to 1910. The United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had a banking system that was, by any modern standard, chaotic. There was no central bank. There was no lender of last resort, no institution that could inject liquidity into the system when banks ran out of money to pay their depositors. There was no mechanism for coordinating the money supply across the country. Banks issued their own currency, backed by whatever assets they chose to hold. This system produced periodic catastrophes, bank panics, moments when depositors, losing confidence in the banking system, lined up to withdraw their money simultaneously, were a recurring feature of American economic life. The panics of 1873, 1884, 1893, and 1896 each produced economic contractions that destroyed businesses and threw people out of work. The pattern was as predictable as it was destructive. The Panic of 1907 was the worst of them. In October 1907, a failed attempt to corner the copper market triggered a cascade of bank failures that spread through the financial system with terrifying speed. Banks in New York began to fail. Trust companies, less regulated institutions that functioned like banks, began to collapse. Depositors lined the streets trying to withdraw their savings from institutions that no longer had the cash to pay them. The United States government had no mechanism to respond. The Treasury could inject some funds, but had no systematic way to stabilize the banking system. There was no Federal Reserve. There was no lender of last resort. What stopped the panic of 1907 was not the government. It was one man, J. Pierpont Morgan. Morgan was 70 years old in 1907, and at the height of his power, he was arguably the most influential private citizen in the United States, the man whose bank had reorganized American railroads, financed American steel, and repeatedly intervened in financial crises to prevent systemic collapse. When the Panic of 1907 struck, Morgan effectively did what a central bank would have done. He gathered the leading bankers of New York in his private library, a building adjacent to his Madison Avenue mansion, and organized a private rescue operation. He decided which institutions would be saved and which would be allowed to fail. He directed the flow of private capital to stabilize the system. He saved the American financial system, and the lesson that many people drew from this was deeply uncomfortable. The most powerful economy in the world had just survived a financial catastrophe because one private banker had decided to intervene. If Morgan had been less capable, less willing, or simply unlucky, the Panic of 1907 might have become a depression. The stability of the American economy was, in a very real sense, dependent on the judgment and the goodwill of a single private individual. Something had to change. The National Monetary Commission was created by Congress in 1908 specifically to study the problem and recommend solutions. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island was appointed chairman. Aldrich was a complex figure. He was genuinely one of the most powerful men in the Senate. A Republican of the old school, a man with deep connections to the business and banking establishment. He was also, by marriage, a Rockefeller. His daughter Abby had married John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1901. The family connection was not irrelevant to understanding whose interests Aldrich represented. The commission spent 2 years studying banking systems in Europe. The Federal Reserve System that was eventually created drew heavily on the model of European central banks, the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, the Banque de France. These institutions had demonstrated that a central bank could stabilize a financial system, provide lender of last resort functions, and manage the money supply in ways that reduced the frequency and severity of financial panics. The political problem was that Americans did not like central banks. This was not irrational. The history of central banking in the United States was a history of political controversy. The first Bank of the United States had been created in 1791 and allowed to expire in 1811. The Second Bank of the United States had been created in 1816 and destroyed by Andrew Jackson in 1832. Jackson's campaign against the bank, his conviction that it represented concentrated financial power in the hands of a wealthy few at the expense of ordinary Americans, had defined American political culture for a generation. By 1910, the populist movement had kept that anti-banking sentiment alive and added new dimensions to it. Farmers and workers in the South and West viewed Eastern banking interests as exploitative. The concentration of financial power in New York, the fact that a handful of institutions controlled the credit that everyone else depended on, was a genuine and serious political problem. Any proposal to create a new central bank, controlled by or closely associated with the existing banking establishment, would face immediate and fierce political opposition. This is why the meeting had to be secret. The men who gathered at Jekyll Island understood the political landscape perfectly. Paul Warburg, perhaps the most sophisticated thinker in the group, had spent years writing about the need for American banking reform. He understood that the substance of what needed to be done creating a central bank with the authority to manage the money supply and serve as a lender of last resort, was not in serious dispute among financial experts. The problem was the form, the name, the appearance. If the proposed institution looked like what it was, a central bank designed and controlled by the major banking interests, it would be politically dead before it was born. The populist wing of Congress would kill it. The progressive movement, which was gaining strength in both parties, would oppose it. The ghost of Andrew Jackson would haunt every floor debate. What was needed was a design that accomplished the same purposes while appearing to accomplish something different. An institution that gave the banking system what it needed while appearing to give the government what it wanted. The Jekyll Island meeting was where that design was worked out. The men worked intensively for 9 days. Warburg was the primary architect. His understanding of European central banking systems was the most sophisticated in the group, and the framework he brought to Jekyll Island formed the basis of what emerged. The discussions were technical and detailed, covering questions of reserve requirements, note issuance, the structure of regional versus national control, and the relationship between the proposed institution and the Treasury. But the most important discussions were not technical, they were political. How do you create a central bank without calling it a central bank? How do you give private banks control over monetary policy while making the institution appear to be a government creation? How do you distribute the institution across multiple regional centers, giving the appearance of decentralization while maintaining the coordination that a central bank requires? The answers to these questions became the Federal Reserve System. The design that emerged from Jekyll Island was, in its political architecture, a work of considerable ingenuity. It would not be called a central bank, it would be called a reserve system. The Federal Reserve System, a network of regional Federal Reserve banks that would, in theory, give representation to banking interests across the country rather than concentrating power in New York. The 12 regional banks would be owned by the private banks in their districts. Banks would be required to purchase stock in their regional Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve would, in this sense, be private, owned by its member banks rather than by the government. But a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, would provide governmental oversight and the appearance of public control. The currency issued by the Federal Reserve notes, which are the dollars in your pocket, would be liabilities of the Federal Reserve banks, not of the government, but they would be legal tender backed by the authority of the United States. This structure was simultaneously genuinely innovative and deliberately obscure. It was designed to be difficult to categorize. Was the Federal Reserve a government institution or a private one? The answer was that it was both and neither. It was a hybrid that the existing political vocabulary had no comfortable category for. And that ambiguity was a feature, not a bug. The men who returned from Jekyll Island understood that the plan they had written could not be introduced as what it was. Senator Aldrich's name was politically toxic in the context of banking reform. He was too closely identified with Wall Street interests, too obviously connected to the Rockefeller family, too associated with the Republican establishment that progressive reformers were fighting. A bill bearing his name, the Aldrich Plan, which was initially floated as a trial balloon, was immediately attacked from the left as a banker's bill. The solution was to have the bill rewritten and reintroduced by Democrats. Representative Carter Glass of Virginia and Senator Robert Owen of Oklahoma became the public faces of what became the Federal Reserve Act. Both were Democrats. Both had progressive credentials. Both could position the Federal Reserve as a reform measure, a constraint on the power of the banking establishment rather than a gift to it. The political maneuvering was complex and took 3 years. The 1912 election, which brought Woodrow Wilson to the presidency, was crucial. Wilson was committed to banking reform, and his administration provided the political will to push the legislation through. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by President Wilson on December 23, 1913. The men who had drafted it on Jekyll Island did not attend the signing ceremony. For years afterward, the meeting was denied. Frank Vanderlip, who had been one of the participants, initially denied any knowledge of a secret meeting when journalists began asking questions. Nelson Aldrich denied it. The official history of the Federal Reserve's creation made no mention of Jekyll Island. It was not until 1916, 3 years after the Federal Reserve Act was passed, that the first public account of the Jekyll Island meeting appeared, and it was not until Frank Vanderlip published his memoirs in the 1930s, decades after the events, that one of the actual participants confirmed what had happened in his own words. By then, the Federal Reserve had been operating for 20 years, the institution was established, the architecture was fixed, the acknowledgement that it had been designed in secret by private bankers on a private island was historically interesting but practically irrelevant. The system was not going to be undone. The Federal Reserve has been one of the most consequential and most controversial institutions in American history. In its favor, the case is substantial. The bank panics that had devastated the American economy with brutal regularity before 1913 essentially ceased after the Federal Reserve was established. The financial system became more stable. The ability to manage the money supply gave policymakers tools that had not previously existed. When the Great Depression struck in the 1930s, the Federal Reserve's response was inadequate. But the lesson of that failure eventually produced the more aggressive interventions that prevented the financial crisis of 2008 from becoming a second Great Depression. Against it, the case is also substantial. The Federal Reserve's design, the hybrid structure that gave private banks ownership and influence while providing governmental oversight, has been a source of controversy from the beginning. The question of whose interests the institution serves has never been fully resolved. The Federal Reserve's decisions on interest rates and monetary policy have enormous consequences for the distribution of wealth in the American economy. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it is more expensive to borrow money, which tends to slow the economy and reduce inflation, but also tends to increase unemployment. When it lowers rates, the opposite tends to occur. These are not neutral technical decisions. They are decisions with winners and losers, and the institution making them was designed in significant part by people who had a clear interest in one set of outcomes rather than another. The men who met at Jekyll Island were not evil. They were responding to a genuine problem: the instability of the American banking system with the tools and frameworks available to them. The institution they designed has, in many respects, performed the stabilizing functions they intended. But they designed it in secret. They designed it to obscure its true nature. They designed it to serve the interests of the banking establishment while appearing to serve the interests of the public. And they succeeded well enough that the system they created has been operating essentially unchanged in its fundamental architecture for more than a century. There is a building on Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. It is the Eccles Building, named for a Depression-era Federal Reserve chairman who was one of the most important figures in the development of modern monetary policy. It is a large, imposing neoclassical structure designed to convey the stability and the authority of the institution it houses. Inside that building Decisions are made that affect the price of your mortgage, the interest on your savings account, the availability of credit for the business you might want to start, the purchasing power of the paycheck you receive. Decisions made by a board appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, but also influenced by the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which are owned by their member banks, which are the private financial institutions whose interests were so carefully considered by the men who boarded that private train in New Jersey in November of 1910. The system they built is still running. The structure they designed in secret is still the structure that governs American monetary policy. The questions they decided to answer in a way that served their interests are still being answered in ways whose full implications are still being debated. The train left New Jersey 115 years ago. The passengers used only their first names. They carried their own bags so the porters could not read the labels, and the institution they designed on that island has never been fundamentally reformed. Think about that the next time you look at the dollar in your pocket. That piece of paper is a Federal Reserve note designed in secret by men whose names you were never supposed to know, on an island where they were never supposed to have been,